Welcome back to the next episode of Heart of Poland with me, your host Patrick Ney, and we are honoured, truly honoured, to be joined, there's a loud noise already, with Dr Stanley Bill, the famous Dr Stanley Bill, the doyen of so many films, discussions, panel debates, and somebody who I think is really at the forefront of helping other people understand what kind of country Poland is, although he's probably far too modest to admit that. Stanley is senior lecturer at the University of Cambridge in Polish Studies. Did I get that entirely wrong?
Exactly right. You were too kind and you exaggerated, but apart from that...
Well, I'm known for that, actually.
It was a kind introduction.
So, let's actually start with my favourite part about the Heart of Poland programme. This has now become a well-founded tradition. The personal sentimental item, Stanley, that you brought with you. We'll stop for a second and have a look at it.
Yes. Well, what I have here is a library card for the Jagiellonian Library in Kraków. It's actually a more recent one from 2016, but I've held one of these continuously since 2004. When I was a student at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. It was a great time in my life. I spent a lot of hours in the Jagiellonian Library. I remember the times when my impression was that the task of the Jagiellonian Library was to protect the books from the students. Things have changed since then. It's a very welcoming institution now. And it always reminds me of the time I spent studying at a great Polish university in Kraków, where I spent a lot of the time when I lived in Poland.
Did you? So how did you end up in Poland then? What was that spark moment? Because
Well,
you're not Polish, you don't have.
No, I'm not Polish. I've got no Polish background, but I was always interested in this part of the world, not just Poland, but the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe from a young age. I'm not really sure exactly what it was that sparked that interest, but
it wasn't a book or a...
No, I can't pinpoint any one moment. I often have the impression that it was probably connected with the fact that I was very young when the big transformation began in this part of the world, when the first at least half democratic elections in Poland happened in 1989, the Round Table Accords. And at that point there was a lot of information about not just Poland, but this entire region in the news in the West and in Australia, where I grew up. And it must have struck some kind of chord in me, the sense that there was something very important happening in this part of the world. I knew I wanted to come here.
Do you sometimes wish you had a better backstory, something with some, a chance meeting?
Something maybe a little bit more exciting, or some kind of family adventure. But it feels like it was one of those things that's actually not explicable.
Yeah.
The things that we simply find interesting for reasons that might be somewhat mysterious. And this region for me was one of those things. And I think it was also connected with the fact that it felt like a familiar region from a certain perspective. It's a part of Europe. There's a sort of shared cultural heritage with my own cultural heritage in Australia, and yet there'd been this very different history. And particularly, a very painful history, obviously, in many periods, and especially in the 20th century. And therefore, there was a combination of similarity and great difference, which struck my interest.
So this is a horrible question. I feel guilty for even asking it. But why should anyone even care about Polish literature?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, of course, that I have to ask myself all of the time, because this is what I'm doing in Cambridge at the moment, is presenting Polish literature, which to some people, and in the UK and many people outside of Poland in general, may seem like a very obscure area of study, almost an esoteric area of study. But I mean, there's a fairly simple response to that question. First of all, it would be the fact that every culture is interesting and has its place in the tapestry of world cultures, and therefore is worth knowing about and has a place at universities, and people should study, have the opportunity at least to study every culture. And of course that's not possible in all places all of the time. But Poland, particularly in the UK, has a special significance. First of all, it's a large country in the European Union. The largest, of course, of the newer members of the European Union. It's playing a more and more important part, not just in Europe, but more broadly in international politics, and the economy is growing at a rapid rate, as we know, and that is a reason to know more about the country. Secondly, from the point of view of the United Kingdom, there are around 1 million Poles living in the United Kingdom today, which means that Polish culture is a part of British culture. It's a part of British life. And therefore I think it's absolutely fundamental that there should be an opportunity at British universities for students to learn about that culture.
Would it be fair to say that up until now in most universities it's not been a field, or even the culture,
yes,
history and politics of Poland has not been particularly important?
Yeah, you're right.
And with it the Central and Eastern European region?
You're right. There still are not very many universities in the UK where one can study Poland's history or its culture or its literature or anything else connected to Poland. And I think that's something that it's important to change. I'm playing a small role along with others in Cambridge.
It's so modest.
But I think there's a lot more to be done, and I'd like to see more programs opening in other British universities.
Are you seeing a rise in interest from other academics, rising in number of applications, that kind of thing?
Yes, and I would say that from the very beginning, from the point of view, from a certain external point of view, there was perhaps a surprise at the relative popularity, in fact, of this course. From the very beginning, there was an uptake from the first year, and I think that Cambridge is quite a small university in terms of student numbers, and we have a good number of students taking this course in the context of Cambridge's student numbers. That surprised people. I can't say it really surprised me, because I think for the young generation of Brits, as I mentioned before, when there are 1 million Poles living in the UK, that means that young British people have had contact with Polish people for most of their lives that they can remember. They have neighbours who are Polish. They have best friends who are Polish. They have a boyfriend or a girlfriend who's Polish.
Do you see that in your students, that they
absolutely
have a boyfriend girlfriend type? It's the classic.
I mean, not necessarily a boyfriend girl. No, in fact, I'd say more common is just they have friends or neighbours. But that's a common reason. When I often ask my students, why have you chosen the course? And these are the two reasons they give. One of them is we have this sense that Poland's a country of growing significance, and yet it's still a country that not many people know much about, and therefore they see it as an opportunity for them to establish an expertise in an area that might be growing in significance and yet is still a relatively small area. So there's an opportunity. But secondly, because my best friend's Polish, or my neighbours are Polish.
Okay, so in order to be able to understand, I'm going to call it the magic of Polish literature, presumably you've had to also master the language to a really high level.
Again, this is something about the course that I emphasise, is that the students are expected to learn Polish, and they do from the very beginning, because the fundamental assumption that we make is you cannot really come to know a culture, a country, its history, its politics, if you don't understand the language. So there's an absolute foundation as far as we're concerned at Cambridge. And it was a foundation for me. And in my case, learning Polish came in a very natural way, because I came here originally as an English teacher. And I lived here for several years. I was working, but I was living among Poles. In fact, in the town of Bielsko-Biała, so not a very large town, but a beautiful town in the southwest of the country. And so I had opportunities to speak Polish in living situations.
If I was, say, interested in Poland, didn't really speak the language to any degree, but wanted to still somehow understand its art and culture, but I'm not realistically going to learn
That's
Polish.
Another really good question. And that's where I think it's important to underline that there are, in a way, two audiences for some of the work that I do in the UK. One is that group of students who are going to learn the language and who are learning the language and are going to come into Polish culture to a much deeper level. But there is plenty you can do to learn about Polish culture and history without knowing the language. Now, there's always going to be that separation.
I'll just remind you, you can always be checking the First News. First News is on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, just about everywhere, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff on.
Well, it's certainly true that there's more and more on the internet now in English about Poland. But secondly, and this is the key importance of translators. and some of my students I hope will be translators in the future. But there's a great deal of Polish literature and works about Polish history and Polish politics that are out there in English. So absolutely, not knowing the language doesn't have to be a barrier. On the other hand, I would strongly encourage people, and I think it was interesting that you were asking me before to give people a sense of hope. I think that's really important, because I think that quite often foreigners have the impression, and Poles can sometimes even give them the impression, that this is such a terribly difficult language that it's an impossible task. Poles are often quite proud of how difficult the language is to learn. And yes, among the European languages, for the average English native speaker, it is not one of the easier ones, let's say. However, it's absolutely doable. It is not a great mystery. The grammar is a tricky thing because it's very complicated, but it is a system. And if you like systems, you can learn it. So I absolutely encourage people out there to have that faith that it's something that's possible and worth doing. And there are a good number of us now who have done it.
There are. 1 and 1 equals 2. And Ilona has just commented to say thank you. And she's grateful that people are interested in learning about Poland. So this is one thing that I notice, is that Polish people tend to, there's a sense of, I don't want to say gratitude, perhaps it's a too strong word, but people do appreciate the fact that foreigners are interested in Polish culture. We talked about how in academic spheres, Poland and Central and Eastern Europe is particularly popular. Why is that? I mean, there's this cultural, there's a language barrier, and there's the past and history which has affected Poland so much. But, you know, Poland's been free for 28 years, and one does feel like Poland's cultural impact, certainly from where I'm from in the UK, is relatively limited. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. As you point out, the burden of history is one of those reasons, and Poland has been, in a way, artificially separated from the rest of Europe at various times in history for reasons that we know about. For example, being behind the Iron Curtain and sort of separate from the West. But secondly, I think there are reasons that are still associated with economic and political clout. Actually, that there's always a hard underbelly to cultural phenomena. Look, Poland's economy is obviously growing very fast. Poland's significance is increasing. But compared to France and Germany, for example, and French and German are much more common languages to learn in the UK still than Polish, it's still a smaller economy. It's still less politically significant, and those would be hard underlying reasons which contribute to this the less mainstream nature of the subject. The other thing is that university departments and programs of study don't necessarily move quickly. They're like any institution. The university takes some time. Now, sometimes universities can react very, very quickly, but in terms of setting up whole programs of study, it's not something that always moves fast, particularly when there are limits to the funds that universities have available at the moment. So this is a challenge that we always face. So there are several reasons why that's still the case. And as you point out, because Poles are aware of this, they are often very generous and very encouraging in their support of people who are trying to find out about the country, who are trying to learn the language. I'm sure you know from your own experience, and again, this is something for people out there who are interested in learning Polish. If you're learning French and you go to France and you can string 1 or 2 words together, you're not going to be slapped on the back and impressing people. Poles are very generous in their praise. If you could say even a couple of words, you get a lot of encouragement here. They know it's a difficult language and they appreciate when people are making the effort.